Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth webinar. We're delighted to have with us this evening Tom Tugendhat, but without further ado, I'll pass over to Sunil Sharma, our COO, who'll be conducting the discussion this evening with Tom.
I want to say we're delighted to welcome Tom Tugendhat to our platform, British Conservative politician serving as the chairman of Foreign Affairs Committee since 2017. There's much we can discuss about today, but I just want to start with how have you been and how have you enjoyed the first week of somewhat freedom?
Well, it's been very nice, and you can tell from my incredibly red forehead that I sat out in the sun for too long on Sunday and hadn't quite appreciated that actually it was summer, or sort of summer. So it's been great actually to have some time with family and friends outside. But it's also been good to be able to come back to the office. I'm here in Parliament now, and it's a long way from full, I can tell you that. But there are people around, and it's beginning to, I think, sound a bit more sensible again. So I hope very much that what we're going to see is life returning to somewhat normal.
Yeah, the battle seems like it's going to long continue. I think just today we've heard Boris Johnson will no longer be going India. I bring up India because, of course, a part of the Commonwealth, and you were also part of a report back in 2019 discussing the UK's relationship with India. How do you see the future of our relationship with India going?
Well, look, I'm glad you reminded me of it was 2019. I couldn't remember exactly when it was, but it was our report was about living bridges, and it is one of the most important relationships we've got. I mean, it's simply not possible to talk about Indian history or British history without talking about the other, if you see what I mean. And the reality is that for 1,000 reasons, some good, some bad, we are bound to each other, and we can look at the past critically, and we should, and people like Satnam Sanghera have written fantastically about it, and very movingly and very powerfully about it. But the reality is our job as politicians, our job as Conservatives, is to look to the future and to look at the opportunities. And that's where I think we share a huge amount together, because the reality is we've got very different economies. We're much smaller, much wealthier, as in much deeper wells of financial capability, but we have demographic issues. We're an older population. We lack the labour capability. India is the reverse. It's relatively a poorer country. I mean, that's certainly not to say that it's poor. I mean, the wealth in India is extremely great, but it's relatively a poorer country. It has, however, got a much younger, highly educated, highly dynamic population. And so, the opportunity to do things together, to effectively do what countries do when they're bigger, which is to do transfers of wealth from old to young and enterprise from young to old, is what we really can do together. And so I look forward to seeing ways in which we can build that up. I'm sorry that the Prime Minister isn't going. I understand his reasons. Sadly, it's the second time he has been unable to go because of COVID, and it's a great shame. Now, I've been a couple of times as chair of the committee, and I was privileged enough to lay a wreath at Delhi Gate. And it's it's a partnership that really can work, but it will work when we don't ignore the past. That would be foolish and impossible. But we put the past in its place, and we look towards the future of cooperation, treating each other as equals. And I think we've got a hell of a chance with India. I mean, Modi's government has taken the Commonwealth more seriously than, well, certainly any of his 2 or 3 predecessors. And he has invested time and energy, recognizing that India is over half the Commonwealth all on its own, certainly in demographics, but also in many other ways as well. And it's, this is a relationship that I think works for India, works for us, because it is, the qualification for entry into the Commonwealth isn't very high. It has to have a connection to the United Kingdom. The country has to have a connection to the United Kingdom in the past, and to be democratic. And frankly, if you have a connection to the United Kingdom in the past, you almost by definition have a connection to India. I mean, probably by definition, I can't actually think of a single Commonwealth country that doesn't have a very strong Indian connection. And you also are, India is the world's largest democracy. So, that overlap of interests means that the Commonwealth really does reinforce both of us. It gives both of us a global reach into a very, very different kind of community. And I think that's powerful for both India and Britain.
As we're talking about a Commonwealth country, it leads me to ask, what do you see as the future for the Commonwealth, and what role do you think we could play, especially now in a post-Brexit Britain?
So I'm always slightly cautious when people say the role of the Commonwealth, in the sense that the Commonwealth should become something like the European Union or NATO or the UN or something like that. It's not that. That's not its job. The job of the Commonwealth is to provide the sort of the interaction between people, the cultural engagement that allows people to recognize that we're cousins, even if we have different spheres of interests, even if, some of us play basketball and some of us play cricket. I mean, that's what it's about. And I think that the areas where I'd really like to see us doing things is, funnily enough, in that cultural space, but also in that skills space. So I'd like to see greater use of student visas. I'd like to see greater use of lawyers associations, perhaps accountants associations, those sort of professional bodies where very often we share things. But I'd also like to see things like Commonwealth Book Prizes, or artistic exchanges or theatre exchanges, because they're not irrelevant. The truth is, culture binds us together in ways that I think is often overlooked and is often seen as not hugely relevant, but actually is very powerful. I mean, if you look at, I don't know who your favourite writers are, Sunil, so I'm not going to guess, but the British Indian writer Vikram Seth, Chino Achebe in South Africa, in Nigeria. You can pick out amazing writers who demonstrate not a commonality, but certainly a thread that can be felt through. A murmur, if you like, rather than a voice.
I think something, we obviously really believe on this platform is a strong UK-India relationship, what it has to offer. It's been largely discussed on our platform, and another massive idea has been the idea of us potentially playing, almost diversifying our portfolio, if you like, and having less reliance on another Asian country in China. Now, we've had so many questions in about China, and I feel like there isn't a detailed political conversation right now that doesn't involve them in some capacity. I want to start with the China Research Group. You became the head of the organization back in April 2020. For our listeners who are unaware of the group, what is it about and what's its purpose?
Sure. Well, look, it started off set up by Neil O'Brien and me, basically to understand China better. I think that if I were to ask people on this group who's the foreign minister of India, I'd have a very good chance of getting the right answer in Jaishankar. If I were to ask the same question of France, I think this group would very likely give me the right answer again in Le Drian. And we could do it with the United States with Blinken. But asking about China, certainly in members of parliament, I think the chances are we'd get a blank look, and Wang Yi's name would not come up. Now, this is an issue because whatever you think of China, you do need to know what's going on, because it matters. And so we really set ourselves up in order to begin to address that question. Now, we didn't set it up because we were entirely neutral. No, we were concerned and cautious, and we have become increasingly concerned and increasingly cautious the more we have learned. So it would be wrong to say that we started off neutral. That's not true. We didn't, but we have certainly become very much more cautious. And so, what we've done is we've invited many people to come and speak to us. In fact, we had Elizabeth Economy and George Magnus, two appropriately named economist, and the other also an economist, speaking on a panel that we had Jeremy Hunt host for us. It was brilliant. And, we have discussions as to what we're seeing and how we see it. And by the way, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to give it a plug. You can go to the chinaresearchgroup.org and you can see all of our stuff is on there, or you can look online, on Twitter or on the Apple Podcasts, and you can download the whole lot. So it's all there. And what we found is increasingly concerning. So I'm not surprised that people are more and more interested. And I'm delighted that we're getting a lot of support for it.
The China Research Group on Spotify I've been listening to, and there are some fantastic episodes there, so I do recommend our listeners to definitely give it a listen. You've been very vocal on matters related to China. An example of that was your statement in wanting Huawei, the Chinese firm, to not supply equipment for UK's 5G digital infrastructure. What led you to not want them to sort of be part of the 5G future in the UK?
Well, for me, it was a pretty simple question, which is, who do you want to build your code? Now, I know that if I were to get code built in Bangalore, for example, where a lot of code is built, I would be having people who may not have exactly the same culture as me. Of course they don't, but they have a similar cultural understanding, by which I mean, at the basic level, they have a similar idea of what an individual is, what a family is, what the state is, what privacy is. The ideas that effectively allow us to be free. Now, if I were to do the same thing in Shenzhen, I would be finding people who do not build on the same basis of individual or privacy or state or liberty. And what we would see, therefore, is encoded into our operating systems in exactly the same way as the English language and indeed other languages have coded into our laws, common understandings. We would see noughts and ones doing that for us. Now, you may say, how can noughts and ones do that? Well, because noughts and ones, binary code is not culturally neutral. Nothing is culturally neutral when it's created by human beings. Indeed, if you look at something that is not noughts and ones, but certainly digits, you look at, for example, the principles of accountancy. Are they culturally neutral? Well, I suppose people may argue that, but they're not, because they have, what they do is they imply an understanding of what it means to be an owner, what it means to be a shareholder, what it means to be a family, what it means to inherit, and so on, based on understandings that otherwise, that can change with culture. So I think that partnership is difficult with countries that don't share that understanding. And that's why when Huawei was trying to effectively become the spinal cord of the British nervous system, I'm afraid I was against it, because while you can certainly, by the extremities, encoding something into your spinal column that is fundamentally applying a different cultural norm is a risk to your future and very, very difficult to change.
I mean, the risks are very evident. I want to move back to COVID-19. You mentioned in the past how Beijing had initially allowed disinformation to spread as quickly as a virus. And there's been lots of examples of a lot of things that have happened, especially in the past year, that have really made us question, if you like, the actions of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. A great example, we had recently a politician on our platform who talked about how they restricted travel between their own cities back in the end of January 2020, but they still allowed international travel up until March. First of all, what sort of disinformation did you see that got spread? And secondly, do you think they deserve more of the blame for what is happening to the world right now? The reason I ask this is because every day it seems like different governments and countries are getting a lot of scrutiny and criticism, but there doesn't seem to be as many people almost questioning what happened in China and the actions of the CCP.
So I think you can certainly look backwards and see moments where China's policies failed the world. Not all of those were deliberate. So, I certainly don't think that the Chinese state deliberately hid the outbreak of the disease in the early days. I think it was a combination of fear of superiors that is perfectly normal in a dictatorship. That's kind of how dictatorships work. So fear of superiors and covering up ineptitude on the ground led to the disease getting out of hand. Once it had got out of hand, the state then at every level felt it had to cover up in order to protect itself from the likely retribution of its people. And that's where we see the scientists being silenced in January 2020, February 2020, and whistleblowers being specifically ordered to shut up. So I think that's where it started. I think your question about whether or not it should be blamed, I mean, responsibility clearly lies with whatever went wrong in the beginning. And I mean, I don't know, but it looks likely that in some way it was a leak from a lab. And we know that in that laboratory in Wuhan, scientists have been working on coronaviruses. So could it have leaked out? Possibly. I mean, I don't know. We don't know. But what we do know is that China has been incredibly secretive about it, or rather that the Chinese Communist Party has been incredibly secretive about it, and that Beijing has since sought to block World Health Organization inquiries and sought to block global cooperation by restricting the amount that countries like or places like Taiwan can share. And so it's become a problem. Now, it's not just that, it's also that when countries like Australia have asked for what is perfectly reasonable in order to defend their own people, which is an inquiry to find out what the origin of this inquiry was, China has put sanctions on them and effectively, tariffs rather than sanctions, but they operate in the same way really, and sought to massively damage Australian commerce. Now that's not the behaviour of a friendly state. That's simply not the behaviour of a state you can rely on. Now, have people started to blame the Chinese people? Possibly, and wrongly. Have they started to blame the Chinese state? A bit. And you certainly see this when you look at the way that China's PPE diplomacy in the early days was an abject failure. They had to fake the fact that the Italians were playing the Chinese national anthem. I mean, bizarre thing to do, but it was a complete lie.
I do want to discuss more things and just China, and maybe in the future we can dedicate a whole segment on China. But I want to finish on China with a couple shorter questions, slightly more sort of personal questions, if you like. You were threatened in August 2020 by what seems to be the CCP. What was that like? And did you then think about backing down and maybe being a bit less vocal?
No, I mean, I was threatened in a rather pathetic way. I mean, it wasn't really a threat to me. And the reason I was noisy about it is because I know from reports that the CCP, the Beijing has in different ways been threatening expatriate Hong Kongers and Chinese citizens here in the UK. And of course, the threats, the kind that they sent me, which just a letter, series of letters to my home, which basically says, I know where you live. Okay, so what? It's not particularly threatening to me, but if I had family in Hong Kong or Beijing or Shanghai, I may be very concerned about it because it would suggest to me that the Chinese state knew what I was doing in the UK and might decide to punish my family back home. And so, I think what they were doing was following the same tactics they would use for an expatriate and finding that it doesn't work. So, I didn't think for a second about backing down. On the contrary, I thought only about making it more public.
Recently, you made the news with the ban to China, and again, it was a pretty big moment and got a lot of people talking. From what I understand, it ultimately was you speaking out against the practices that they are adopting towards the Uyghur Muslims population. We've heard you recently talk about the CCP and almost hacking your emails. For our listeners who are unaware of both moments, could you speak more on what it was like getting the ban and then the hacking claims?
Sure. So the ban, I mean, again, on one level, it makes no difference at all. I wasn't picking out summer houses in Macau, so it's not a particular issue. And much as I like Chinese food, I'm perfectly happy to eat it in the UK or indeed in many other countries around the world, and that means I can't go to Wuhan. So be it. So that's not a particular threat to me, but it's designed not really to threaten me. It's designed to cause uncertainty to others and to cause others to doubt. Because what they're trying to say is, if you speak out, then your business may be at risk, then your travel may be at risk. Now, Chinese state knows very well that my travel isn't at risk and that my business isn't at risk, because they know very well that I don't have a business interest in China. So that's not what they're trying to threaten. What they're trying to do is to threaten others by using me and other members of parliament as an example. And that's why I think it's important that we call it out and that we make sure we don't back down. The reality is that this is a dictatorial state behaving as dictatorial states do in a particularly threatening manner. The fact that threats don't work against us shouldn't matter too much. But certainly when you see the way in which this was called out, it's particularly striking, because the sanctions that were put on communist officials sent by Beijing were put on those officials because they were abusing and violating the human rights of Chinese citizens, whereas people like me, who was sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party, was sanctioned for calling out the violation of the human rights of Chinese citizens. The irony is really quite striking and in fact very saddening. So I'm afraid I don't take any joy in this sanctioning. It speaks to me of great sadness at the reality that the Chinese state has so failed to defend its own citizens that it would rather threaten others and try to silence them rather than actually defend the civil rights of its own people.
I think the majority of our organisation and many other conservatives would absolutely love what you're saying, completely agree. And we've seen more politicians speaking in a similar manner to yourself regarding China, although few have probably had the exposure or the level of threats and now a travel ban. I'm going to play devil's advocate a little here and ask, is there an internal conflict? I ask this because what would you like us as a country and others to do, knowing that potentially should we get stricter or slightly hostile towards China, then there is a real possibility that that may not be the best economic move, if you like, in the short term. And also, is there a fear by us distancing ourselves from China that the harsh reality is that there may be other countries more willing to take advantage and build closer ties as it could economically benefit them?
Well, look, I think we shouldn't be blind to the risk, and I realise that there are implications for the British people, but I have to say the level of support I'm getting from people across the country is quite striking. So I would suggest that the British people are not stupid. They understand very well the implications of having a difficult relationship with one of the world's largest economies. But they also understand the importance of, standing up for human rights. Look, this is the country that in the 1860s, people from the poorest communities around Manchester refused to process slave-grown cotton that was coming in from the Confederate States. This is the country that, across the country used to sell bowls, sugar bowls, that had the bottoms painted red to symbolize the blood of the slaves that had been killed in the making of sugarcane and the production of sugar in the 1800s. This is a country that has consistently demonstrated that its people are on the right side of the human rights debate. Not everybody, of course, but certainly the many people. In fact, we were speaking earlier about the cooperation with India. Gandhi himself was very clear in going to the towns of Lancashire to see the cotton makers, and the support he got, and he knew he got from them because of his homegrown cotton movement, was really quite remarkable. This was people who were who understood that they were standing up for poor Indian villagers at their own economic expense. And I think, I think that the baseline of integrity and decency that existed then exists now. And I think people don't want to find out that they're wearing clothes made from slave-grown cotton in Xinjiang. They don't want to find out that the tomato paste they've bought comes from slave-grown tomatoes in Xinjiang. That people want to stand up for what's right. So I think that's the first thing. The second is, of course there are going to be other countries that in some ways will look perhaps at filling that gap, but the list of other countries is shrinking fast because the cost of this relationship is being seen very clearly. You don't have to be you don't have to be very well informed to see the implications for Australia of this clash, where China is, or rather the Chinese Communist Party is looking to bully the Australian government into subservience. You don't have to read too many newspapers to see about the clashes that we're seeing in northern India, in the mountains between the Chinese People's Liberation Army and the Indian Army, where we're seeing different forms of attempts of control of some of the high passes. We're seeing this around the world, and if you speak to, as I have done, people in Tanzania and Zambia, you will find similar stories. I mean, it's not the same issues, of course it isn't, but it's similar issues where you're seeing various people raising deep concerns about the nature of the relationship. And so I think that this is something that we can not only lead on and stand up for, but actually many others would like to join us too.
I think something would be interesting to hear about is China's foreign policy, in particular its relations with poor regions of the world. I understand the Chinese research group's done some really good things in relation to that. Again, for our listeners who aren't so aware of the general sort of Chinese foreign policy, it'd be great to hear more on that from yourself, in particular with regions of the countries with sort of poorer wealth.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, quite a lot of the foreign policy we're seeing playing out in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, which you're referring to, and parts of Southeast Asia, which I'm sure you're also referring to, and some of different areas sort of respond differently, right? So in many of the poorer countries, we're seeing a form of intervention, which is being referred to as debt diplomacy. That's not quite right in the sense that it's rather more haphazard than that. It's large banks being told to go out and lend money and so on. But it's certainly resulting in levels of control that are deeply concerning. And we're seeing assets being seized when unreasonable debts cannot be paid. The most obvious example of this is Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. But actually there are many others around the world, including possibly, and I hope it doesn't come to this, in Montenegro. So this isn't just about African countries or Asian countries, it's also about some European countries. And we're certainly seeing that attempt as well. We're also seeing different forms of in which China is trying to undermine the economic system that we currently have, which is why things like Alipay are seeking to replace the dollar-based system in Southeast Asia. Not terribly successfully yet, but certainly it's starting. And we're also seeing China attempting to undermine cohesion in existing alliances. If you look at the way, for example, Beijing's actions in the European Union are seeking to pull apart the partnership with some elements of vaccine diplomacy, where Sinovac is being used to vaccinate some people in some countries, and the way in which the investment is being used and different forms of pressure are being used. We're seeing a form of foreign policy that is pretty divisive, deliberately so, and based on a model that worked for China's internal growth, which is infrastructure investment leads to business growth, which leads to tax receipts for the center. And at a wider scale, a global scale, is a form of imperialism, and with Beijing in the center and different satrapies on the outside.
But like I was saying earlier, I think we could probably talk about this for a very long time. And one day I think it'd be great to have this discussion, maybe even with General Robert Spalding, who I'm not sure if you know or have met him, but he worked for the White House, and he was one of the first really to attack this CCP in his book, Stealth War, and has been on our platform and is returning soon. I want Yeah, I think his book Stealth War, I think, came out in 2018, so before COVID-19, and it was a real eye opener for a lot of people. And I think it's gained a lot more coverage in the past year with COVID-19. And yeah, he's done some really fantastic work in really raising awareness about what the CCP have done. And he was on our platform recently, and he's coming again in May. And similar to him, you both have a military background. So I wanted to get an understanding of what sort of impact that has had in your political career so far.
Well, I mean, on some levels, I wouldn't overstate it. It's had, it's been a part of my life, an important part of my life. But it's the real impact, I think, on my political career has been getting to know our country. And one way in which I've got to know our country is by meeting people from every walk of life and every different background through the military. So it's not, in a funny way, it's not the military itself, but it's the environment into which I was put. There's one thing about the military: you meet people from all over the place. I served alongside people who were first generation migrants from some countries, some people, in fact, who were literally who didn't have British passports. They were Commonwealth citizens and joined as Commonwealth citizens, and then served alongside, not too closely, but alongside somebody whose grandmother was the Queen. So you really do meet quite a range of people, and I think that's what affected my interest in politics, because my interest in politics is obviously about foreign affairs. I mean, that's quite clear. That's why I chose to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee, or to try to. But it's also about about people. I mean, the fundamental job of a British politician is to look after the prosperity and happiness of the British people, and that's what I try to do. And you can't do that unless you like the British people, and unless you unless you understand at least some of it. So that's what I try and do, and I have to say it's a great privilege.
You're obviously incredibly knowledgeable about what's going on in the world, and I wanted to ask, what regions and countries across the globe do you worry about the most? I know we've spoken a lot about China, aside, if you like, from China, and where do you think we as Britain can have the greatest impact?
So I always worry about Britain the most, because that's my job. But I think, I think there are areas where we should be, we should have concerns. We should be concerned about what's going on in Europe at the moment. There are many positives, but there are also some real challenges for our European friends and partners. And while we are, by the fact that I'm here, and I know by the fact you're there, we're committed to the Commonwealth, and we see it as absolutely essential. We also know that we have important relations in Europe, and we want them to prosper too. So there's a whole series of areas where we could certainly discuss that. But I think the real challenge that I'm particularly concerned about today is two countries that I think matter much more than are properly appreciated. And forgive me, we started off speaking about India. This is not to belittle India or Southeast Asia at all. The two countries that get overlooked a lot and really have so much to offer are Kenya and Nigeria. And I think these are hugely important countries. It's said that about half the African population is going to be Nigerian in only a few years' time. I think it's 2050. Because of the growth rates that we're seeing in the Nigerian population. And Nigeria is one of the few countries that is pretty much half and half Christian Muslim. It doesn't have a minority religion in that sense. Both religions are roughly equal. And it has huge challenges. This is a government that has had great wealth in the Delta State and great challenges of corruption and infrastructure and many other different aspects all over, and terrorism in the north. And yet it's one of the richest countries in the world in terms of culture. I mean, you just have to watch any of the Nollywood movies to see that, this is a people with an imagination and an ability to tell stories, the like of which, we don't see very often. I mean, it's an amazing people with energy and life that is inspiring, and yet has got real challenges. And the same is true of Kenya. This is an amazing place with people who have demonstrated time and again ingenuity and enterprise, but has got real challenges. And both of them have got challenges for different reasons. With Kenya, I mean, the region isn't easy, and with Nigeria, the internal challenges aren't easy. So those are two areas that concern me. But where I think that, working together, and I do mean in partnership, I don't mean some sort of return to an old days of, bad old days of patronizing relationships. There's no point in that. It would fail and it would be wrong. But I think as partners, I think there's an awful lot we can do together. And I'm a passionately pro-Nigerian, pro-Kenyan. I really believe in that alliance, and I really believe that we could do a lot for each other.
I think our parliamentary chair, Helen Grant, will be very happy to hear that about Nigeria being the trade envoy to Nigeria.
She's doing a very good job. And the reality is, the reality of the relationship, actually, similarly to the way we talk about India, is, this isn't too many people look at sub-Saharan Africa, less so India now, but too many people look at sub-Saharan Africa as though it was still a DFID issue, as, an aid issue. It's not an aid issue. It's about, cooperation on the rule of law, on enterprise and all the rest of it. And while it's certainly true, for example, that there's an awful lot of foreign investment in Nigeria into things like resources, or in sub-Saharan Africa and things like resources, in Nigeria particularly energy resources, the level of investment into SME type enterprise, into the kind of Nigerian startups that are really transforming the online economy, is very, very low. And this is a great shame. And by the way, I don't mean it's just a great shame for Nigerian opportunity, which it is. It's a great shame for the rest of the world, because there is ingenuity that is literally sitting on the sort of, sitting on the desk that is not being developed because we're not investing in the people who could do it. And I think this is something we really need to look at. I'd love to see serious startup investment, entrepreneurial investment opportunities in Nigeria and Kenya and Somalia and Somaliland and other places too. But
I mean, you've been chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee since 2017, and a lot of our listeners may not be fully aware of what that role entails. So it'd be great to hear more about that role and what sort of things you sort of do day to day, and the kind of plans for the future, if you like.
Sure. Well, look, the principal job is to hold the governments to account on its foreign policy. So my principal job is to see what the government's doing and to ask whether or not it's doing the right thing on behalf of Parliament and the people. That's after all the job of Parliament. The job of the executive is to slightly different, but but our job is to represent the interests of the people and make sure we hold the government to account. So that's what I do. Now, the way we do it is we conduct inquiries into different areas, and you mentioned one of them earlier, very kindly, thank you, about India. And there we were critical of the government because, frankly, we thought the government could do more, and it wasn't doing as much as we thought. And some of the things we asked for, they've now implemented, including changing visas so that students can now work in the UK after their visa, after their student time, if you like, the student period of their visa is complete. They can then stay on and work for a bit. But there are other things that we asked for that haven't yet happened. We'd like to see a much greater investment in the exchanges between things like the Indian Institute of Technology and Imperial College in London. We'd like to see proper living bridges between them. So that's just one example. Other areas we've looked at. We've looked at many areas. In fact, today, I should have said this, I can't believe I didn't say this. Today, we've just published our views on environmental diplomacy for the COP conference going forward, and in a few months' time, we'll have another looking at what the government has done and whether or not we think the government is in the right direction. So, that's the broad thrust of it. But one of the things that's great about it is you're working with parliamentarians from across the House, which is interesting. It's not a partisan position. I mean, I approach it as a Conservative, of course, but it's not a partisan position, and that's in the sense of most things. But you also get to meet many interesting people. So, I'm constantly meeting foreign ministers, prime ministers, and presidents who come through, and that's a great pleasure.
I think a region we haven't discussed today, and it's something that's very popular on our platform also, is CANZUK, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And there is a real growing momentum regarding closer relationships with these three other countries. And we're seeing a lot of support from Canadian MPs on our platform, as well as New Zealand and Australian ones. We've got the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, later on this week discussing a bit about it too. What do you think CANZUK can offer, and what do you see as its full potential to the UK economy in particular?
So look, I think CANZUK's challenging. I mean, there's a reason we are separate countries when we started out as one. So let's not pretend that we can reverse and sort of somehow create a sort of a multi-jurisdictional state. I think that would be unrealistic, and I don't think it's what any of the CANZUK nations really want. So I think we should look at what we can reasonably do. And I think this is where we need to be talking quite seriously about lowering the barriers between us. Some of those barriers are physical, in the sense of visa requirements and ability to stay in different countries for certain periods of time. And there we could certainly look at, and I would be very keen to see ways of making sure we went from being, simply a 3-month visa waiver to maybe a 2-year visa waiver, for example, to look at business opportunities. That would certainly be a cheaper way of making sure that people could work in each other's countries. But I think there's also ways in which we could look at lowering duties and tariffs between us, and increasing the ways in which we cooperate. I mean, it's worth remembering that we share a common understanding, or common basis of law, and so aligning our markets is not easy. Let's not pretend it's easy, but it is at least based on similar principles. And indeed, I was going to say it's based on British law. Actually, that's not entirely true. Some of it based on Australian law. The South Australian legal principle, the Torrens Treaty, transformed the ownership system of the entire, what was then the Empire, now of course the Commonwealth, and has underpinned so much of the growth of our economies since then. So I think there's an awful lot of work we can do together. I would like to see, judicial conferences so that we align as much as possible interpretations of commercial law, making it easier to do business between us, that we promote cooperation between clerks and MPs and so on, so that we find ways of making sure that British people come together. I mean, I think there's real opportunity to do this well, and invest in it. But going all the way from Auckland to Vancouver that's a hell of a jurisdiction. So I think it's finding ways to make us work as smoothly as possible, rather than trying to build a single entity.
There's much more we can discuss. I'm actually conscious of the time, and I wanted to also bring up something that I think you discussed quite a while ago, which was when you sort of faced anti-Semitism during your election campaign in 2019. A lot of our listeners probably may not know that you do have some Jewish heritage, and do you think it's something that we don't almost tackle enough, in terms of, there's a lot of other sort of, if you like, minority movements that probably dedicate more time to and receive more, if you like, media attention. Do you think we maybe with the anti-Semitism, it's not possibly highlighted enough? And also, what was that experience like in 2019 when you were receiving that sort of abuse?
Well, I have to say it was mostly surprising. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that it was sort of life-changing for me. It wasn't particularly pleasant, but it, just another thing. But I was mostly surprised because, it's not something I've experienced particularly much in the UK. And, I don't think your perceptions of this are just as valid as mine, and I hope you'll give me your views too. But I don't think that the UK is a particularly racist state. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't racism in the UK. Of course there is. But when I compare it to actual signs on doors in Chinese supermarkets that say no black people allowed in, it's pretty starkly different. Now we may have had a similar history in that sense, but I'm very glad that we've moved on from that, thank God. So I was mostly surprised about it because actually discrimination, while it still exists, is something that I think British people are, broadly speaking, combating well. And then it sort of came back, and anti-Semitism came back really with the rise of Corbyn. It was quite extraordinary how one person's turning a blind eye deliberately could effectively normalize and re-empower one of the oldest hatreds. I was astonished. I thought it was long gone.
Yeah, I mean, I would ask for my opinion. Yeah, I completely agree in terms that I don't see this at all as a racist country. Of course, there are racial incidents, and we've seen that. But I, when the report was released, it's something that I definitely did agree with, and I think the report does highlight that there are racial incidents, but there's also a number of other, I think, factors. I look at sort of my community in the sense of being a British Indian first generation, and I see 3 British Hindus, 3 British Indians in the cabinet, and it makes me proud, and it makes me realize that most importantly, they're on merit as opposed to a quota system, if you like.
I'm sorry, tell me seriously that you think Rishi Sunak is there because he's representing the Indian community. He's not. He's there because he's the best person to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the United Kingdom. It's the only reason he's there. It's literally, there is no other.
Yeah.
He's brilliant. That's why he's there. That's it.
So I think I completely agree with that statement, and I think I look at sort of British Indians, and I think that report was fantastic because it highlighted a number of other issues that we need to look at. And I think sometimes, again, Robert Spalding was someone we had recently, where we don't want to go down this sort of slippery slope of where we pick on certain minorities and select policies for the minorities as opposed to making policies that make that are great for the population. I think John Howard, Australian former Prime Minister, said this on our platform, where he said, as a former Prime Minister, he always looked at making policies that benefit Australia, and he was really big on small business, and he always believed in small businesses helps Indians, helps Chinese, helps Australians. There's no color, and he's kind of worried sometimes some of our sort of, if you like, far left movement in this country and in America, how they there's almost this concern where we may be moving towards if you can prove that you're a minority with the most historic backlash, if you like, or the issues you've had the most historic issues, you get pushed up the chain, if you like, as opposed to just selecting people who are the best at their job, e.g., like you've said, Rishi Sunak, Priti Patel, and Anok Sharma. So it's interesting to hear that.
Well, it's certainly one of the things that strikes me is, for very obvious reasons, because of the racism of various people in the Conservative Party in the 1960s, the Conservative vote amongst certain communities has been lower than I think it should be. Because when you talk about conservatism, you're talking about entrepreneurialism, family, resilience, and migrant communities. I don't care whether they come from Poland or Uttar Pradesh, very often, for very obvious reasons, rely on tight networks of family, of community, and start up their own businesses. It's not a racial thing. It's an observation of communities that tend to do that. Jewish, Polish, Catholic, Indian, Hindu, or Muslim. It doesn't. The connection is neither the race nor the religion. The connection is the movement, and and when you see people starting businesses and valuing the integrity and the hard work and the community that requires to hold together, those are conservative values, and we should be proud of them.
Yeah, I think you've said it there perfectly. You know, we've had I think Bob Blackman recently on our platform, who talked about how a lot of the, if you like, the traditional Indian values or the general spirit is very conservative. Like a lot of them fall in line with each other. And we were sort of discussing how I think it's a common term, shy conservatives across the country, regardless of skin color, but it's probably even more so with ethnic minorities that tend to be a bit more cautious, if you like, proclaiming their conservatism. So I think that's why, you know, we were saying how great it is to have Rishi Sunak, Priti Patel, these guys who are very different in terms of their views and in terms of probably how socially liberal are, but it's great to have that.
You've got quite a range there between Priti Patel,
yeah,
or Alok Sharma with Rishi somewhere in the middle. It's quite a range.
I think it's great for that community though, and I think because, you know, sometimes there's this real thing with ethnic minorities. Why, you know, Priti Patel in particular is the one I really enjoy. Don't always agree with every single one of her policies, but I like the fact that she's really encouraging a different kind of thought process amongst ethnic minorities, because I feel like there's almost this feeling where we should kind of be towards the middle, maybe towards the left leaning, and I think you kind of need people like that who are a bit more, if you like, on the right side. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Munira Mirza, who runs the policy unit in Number 10, is very, very clear thinking, highly intelligent woman who has views probably a little bit to the right of mine, but, you know, she's a passionate advocate of her corner.
I'm sure we could again discuss this in probably quite a lot of detail, and I'm sure at some point it would be great if we could. We actually have a former MP amongst us in Oliver. I'm trying to see if Oliver would like to go live and ask his question directly. I'll wait to see. If not, I can ask away anyway. Oh, here we go. You're just on mute at the moment, Oliver.
Thank you. I think I've unmuted myself.
How are you, old friend?
Very much indeed for coming to join us. Just wondered whether or not you think that the Commonwealth now should be a replacement for our EU partners, and whether they should be our trade partners now. Or should we make much more effort with the Commonwealth?
So I don't think it works in quite the binary sense of you can swap one for the other. I mean, because many Commonwealth countries already have trade partnerships in a different way. So the African Union, for example, the South African Development Partnership and things like that, SADC and so on. I mean, there's a whole series of different trading blocks within the Commonwealth that overlap or that are internal to. And so it's not that we can replace one for the other, but I think that where we can build up the relationship, I think, is through common understanding of certainly cultural links, legal links, and the links in professional services, which are so often similar because, you know, we've educated each other's children in each other's universities. I'd like to see that built in. And in fact, one of the things, I'm sorry, I'm suddenly reminded of something that I meant to mention earlier, is we're seeing more and more British kids going to study at Indian universities as they have done at American universities, because the quality of education is fantastic. And not all of those kids, in fact, by a long way, not all of those kids are Brits of Indian origin. They're just Brits who are going, you know, some of them are of Indian origin, but plenty aren't, going to study in universities in India, where the quality of education is fantastic and very often rather cheaper than it is in the UK.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Oliver.
Nice to see you again, Oliver.
Good to see you.
I think that concludes this chat. It's been great having you on, Tom, and hopefully we can do this one day in person in the not too distant future. But yeah, thank you for your time today.
I'd like that very much, but I have to say one of the nice things about doing things on Zoom is we in Parliament, and probably you on the French friendship group as well, have been able to invite people from around the world. And the Commonwealth allows you to do that. So I'm delighted that you've had me on this afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you everyone for also tuning in. We have our next event coming up next week with Mike Lake, a Canadian politician. As Tom mentioned, we have had quite a few number of people from across the globe. And we'll also have a video segment from the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, Michael McCormack, and plenty of other events coming up. But thank you for your time, everyone.